Hola muchachos, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Aquí tienen el horario para hoy, viernes el 7 de febrero. Our learning target for today in this new chapter is to be able to describe your ideal city or community, perhaps that in which you will live after you graduate from high school here in a short time. Your warm-up question for today are the questions on page 65 that I asked you to do excuse me, for your homework for today. You can watch the video that I created for these questions, but just really quickly while we're here, again at the bottom of page 65, activity 3, ¿Qué opinas? What do you think, or what's your opinion on these 3 questions relating to the reading that's on page 64 about the use of bikes in Colombia, the programs that they're doing there to reduce vehicular traffic, increase bicycle and pedestrian traffic, reduce or lower rather their carbon footprint, and then of course there are health benefits there as well. And Bogota, Colombia on the left-hand side, and then a little bit on the right they talk about the program Ecobici. Here we are, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, that last paragraph. So using that information, answer the following questions. ¿Qué opinas de las iniciativas del uso de bicicletas en ciudades como Bogotá y Buenos Aires? What do you think about the initiatives regarding the use of bikes in the cities of Bogotá and Buenos Aires? And again, you're going to be using the expressions of opinion that may or may not call for the subjunctive on page 30. Expressions of emotion. 34. Expressions of doubt, denial, or disbelief if you have some reservations about those initiatives. And then 35, if you actually you're quite confident in their efficacy or in their ability to be effective. All right, that's number 1. Number 2, ¿conoces alguna ciudad en tu país que tenga una iniciativa similar? Do you know of a city in our country that has a similar initiative? What's it like? How would you describe it? ¿Crees que en tu comunidad se puede implementar una iniciativa como estas? Do you believe, that our community can implement an initiative similar to that of Bogotá and Buenos Aires? And this is going to serve as your cultural comparison, responding to those three questions. And time permitting, I'll carve out some time where you can do that in class and be done. That's the only thing that's due for tonight, and then no homework over the weekend at all. Do tonight that cultural comparison, your responses to those 3 questions, utilizing the reading on page 64. And then the information you composed in activities 1 and 2 on the same page 65. So after we share out, maybe not do speed dating, maybe we'll just go ahead and record your homework. We'll see how things go. But after sharing out your responses to those questions, we're going to get into some new notes on the use of the subjunctive with adjective clauses. Those notes can be found on page 66 here. There's also a PowerPoint here that I'm going to walk you through. And then we're going to do some guided practice activities. 1 and 2 for sure we'll get to. 4 we may not. And that'll serve as our warm-up next week if we are unable to get there. So let's go through these notes together. And again, that PowerPoint you can find embedded in the agenda. The subjunctive and adjective clauses. So we talked about earlier in the semester adverbial clauses, right? Adverbial clauses, just to pull that up real quick. A little bit more, forgive me. Adverbial clauses, so an adverbial clause describes a verb, obviously, an adverb describes a verb, and the conjunctions that we used, taking a little bit longer than I had that, there we are. So the conjunctions that we had looked at, we'll go back a little bit further, I believe it's 37 and 38. 38 and 39. So here are the conjunctions that we looked at. Conjunctions combine a main clause with what's called an adverbial clause. And there were certain conjunctions that we used that required the subjunctive. Anytime there was an action or an event in the main clause that was uncertain or was to be taking place in the future, these conjunctions require the subjunctive in what's called the adverbial clause, what comes after the que, right? Those conjunctions that we looked at, a menos que, antes de que, or después de que, the most commonly used of the group, para que, all of these requiring the subjunctive because fundamentally they're used with main clauses that express uncertainty, whether it's a hypothetical situation, an action that's going to take place in the future, or maybe a command that, we don't know if someone's going to follow it or not. There were other conjunctions that we looked at that gave us some choice whether to use the subjunctive or the indicative, and that was all based on a future action in the main clause or a command. If there's a future action or command, it would use the subjunctive. If it was a habitual action, something that happens regularly, especially with an adverb of frequency being present, or if the action already happened in the past, if these two situations were applicable in the main clause, well then the subordinate clause or the adverbial clause was in the present tense, present indicative we say, or even the past if it's both of them are past actions like this example here. So that's where we're coming from. That's where we last left off. And so this new concept introduces something that's called adjective clauses, cláusulas adjetivas. So what we're going to cover here in this part of the curriculum is that the subjunctive can be used in adjective clauses when the main clause expresses the existence of someone or something that is uncertain or indefinite. So let's take a look at this. And I'm actually going to pull up, the PowerPoint again. There we are. So the subjunctive. Let's talk about when the subjunctive is used in adjective clauses. The subjunctive is used when the subordinate clause, the clause that comes after que, right? In this case, we're going to call that an adjective clause. The subjunctive is used in an adjective clause when the person, place, or thing that's in that clause does not exist or whose existence is uncertain or indefinite. We just talked about that a moment ago. So compare the differences in how the indicative and the subjunctive is used. Indicative meaning regular present tense, verb conjugations that you recognize. Necesita el libro que tiene información sobre Venezuela. I need the book that has information about Venezuela. If you look at the subjunctive equivalent over here, necesito un libro que tenga información sobre Venezuela. Notice the subjunctive of the verb tener as opposed to the indicative. And take particular note of the noun itself and the article that comes with it. The book is certain or definite. When we say el libro, we know the book that we're referring to. We're familiar with it. So there isn't any uncertainty or lack of existence, right? We know it exists. We've identified that. And therefore, there isn't a use of the subjunctive in this particular sentence, right? Indicative is used. However, in this example, necesito un libro que tenga información. I need a book. I don't know if this book exists or not. A book, any book. So the way I'm presenting it, there's a little bit more of uncertainty or doubt as to whether or not the book even exists, right? Quiero vivir en esta casa que tiene jardín. I want to live in this house that has a garden. Quiero vivir en una casa que tenga jardín. Again, very similar difference. We have the same verb used in both of these examples, tener. The indicative is used here because this house, you may be looking right at it, right, in this particular example. There's no doubt of the existence of this house. A house, a little bit more hypothetical, right? Uncertain as to whether or not that type of house even exists. So that's key, right? When the main clause refers, when the subordinate clause refers to a person, place, or thing where we're not sure if it exists or not, then that's when we're going to use the subjunctive. And then grammatically speaking, you want to pay close attention to the articles that come before the noun, whether they're definite or demonstrative, and we'll get into that a little bit later, el or esta, or if they are indefinite, non-specific, like un or una, which mean a, which is indefinite in English. Last one, an example here. En mi barrio hay una heladería que vende helado de mango. There is an ice cream shop or ice cream parlor that sells mango ice cream. This exists, right? There is or there are, no doubt. No hay. En mi barrio no hay ninguna heladería. There isn't a ice cream shop. So when negated, we're saying straight up it does not exist. Not that we're uncertain or indefinite. We know it doesn't exist at all. But that lack of existence is what requires the subjunctive. Certainty, uncertainty. That's really the main difference between these two, as we've seen in other situations, as we did before with the subjunctive and conjunctions. The use of the subjunctive with particular conjunctions. All right, speeding through the rest of this. So we call the antecedent this noun in question that comes from the main clause. Grammatically speaking, is called the antecedent. You may be familiar with that term in English grammar. We have that as well in English. And we just talked about these examples. When it refers to a person, place, or thing that is clearly known, certain or definite. Take a look at these examples. Supermercado, que vende. Profesor, que enseña. Alguien que va. Un amigo que vive. Certainty associated with all of these. Observe the important role that the indefinite article, this is what I was referring to earlier, versus a definite article plays in determining the use of the subjunctive and adjective clauses. Observe the role that a definite article, such as el, la, los, or las, it's a definite article, aka the, like how we saw in our initial example here. Yeah? Notice the impact that the type of article used has on whether or not the subjunctive is being used. So back to this note here. ¿Conoces el restaurante italiano que está cerca de mi casa? The Italian restaurant. I know it exists. As opposed to un ristorante italiano. Un being a, meaning we're not sure, we're uncertain as to whether or not the restaurant exists at all, and therefore the subjunctive is used. Certainty as opposed to uncertainty. Certainty, el, esta, demonstrative and definite articles, and even verbs that demonstrate certainty, like there is or there are, and then uncertainty with the subjunctive, indefinite articles like un and una, and then ninguna, negated. If it's negated altogether, then it's going to be in the subjunctive. For those of you paying very close attention, you'll notice that una is used here and used here, and you're probably a little bit confused. Well, how can una, which is an indefinite article, be applied to both the subjunctive and the indicative? We'll get into that in just a moment. Almost there, almost done. So we talked about alguien and nadie. These are inherently uncertain. Inherently uncertain. don't know who that somebody or anybody is, right? They functionally always are going to be in the subjunctive. As you can see here, alguien que pueda, nadie que pueda. Un empleado, indefinite article, means that there's some uncertainty there as to whether or not this type of employee even exists. Al empleado, the employee, very similar to the previous examples we've seen. That article, right? El as opposed to un really triggers that difference in certainty or lack thereof. Okay, subjunctive and adjective clauses. In the form of a question, there's inherent doubt, right? If you're asking about something, you're not sure, probably, about the answer. And therefore, the subjunctive is inherently used there. Even though we're not negating I here, as we saw in a previous example. I won't go back. I'll stay here. We're going to use the subjunctive because it's in the form of a question. In the form of a response, if there is certainty, if who responds to the question knows the information and is certain about it, well, then the indicative would be used in the answer. Now, back to the example that I was referring to. Verbs that commonly are associated with the subjunctive. You can see this list here. Some of them we've seen before. The verb querer, to want. The verb necesitar, to need. The verb conocer, we've seen in some of these examples, to know. Encontrar, to find. Buscar, to look for. And then haber, that's the verb to have or to be, to exist. I means there is or there are, or are there, in this case, in the form of a question. Si hay un parque. Yes, there is a park. That's the verb haber, which really only has one conjugation, I, in the present indicative. And if you go back to the example that we were looking at before, what's the difference between these two sentences? Because both of them have the indefinite article una, and therefore it might be a little bit confusing. Well, I thought una was always associated with the subjunctive. Why is it in the indicative here? Well, I is there is or there are, and it's only associated with the subjunctive, and I wish they were to clarify this, only in the form of a question with I, right? Only when haber is used in a question, or when it's negated, when there's no in front of I. And that example is here, right? When it's in a statement, when you're blatantly indicating what exists, right? What there is or what there are, then it's in the present indicative. I wish they would. Matter of fact, if I were you and doing your notes, put a little star next to haber. Yeah, in the subjunctive it is used, but only in the form of a question, or only when it's negated, like in this example. When I say negated, with a no in front of it. But back to the example that I was referring to, how is it that una is used here and both here for examples of indicative and subjunctive? Well, in addition to una being used here, what else makes this an example of the subjunctive mood? The use of quiero, right? Which we saw in our expressions of emotion. I wonder if anybody's still watching this video. I think I'm just geeking out myself at this point. That's fair. It's one of these expressions of emotion, right? Querer, maybe not here. I could have sworn it was in one of these expressions. I thought of emotion for sure on page 30. Maybe I'm glossing over it and not catching it. I would say querer synonymous with esperar. I don't know why it doesn't show up here on expressions of emotion, but we've seen the verb querer before used with the subjunctive, right? To talk about future hopes or aspirations. I feel like it would fit in quite nicely here, but for whatever reason the book doesn't include it there. So yeah, this is why the subjunctive is used here as well, not only because we're not sure if the house exists or not, but because we're also using an expression of emotion at the very beginning. And there you see the verb necesitar, which is part of that list of verbs commonly used in the subjunctive. This video is at the 20-minute mark. I'm going to go ahead and begin to wrap up. I'm going to do the practice with you here. I'll walk you through the first few exercises of practice that we're going to do on page 68, activities 1 and 2. And then I'll give you the correct answer so you can compare and see how you did. All right, the answers to the guided practice here at the very bottom. I'll give you a moment. I'll pause, and then I'll give you the correct answers and the explanation. All right, so number 1, or forgive me, the instructions to choose whether the subjunctive or indicative should be used, and be sure to speak to as to why. Necesito una persona que pueda. The verb necesitar, una, indefinite article. We're not sure if this person exists. Buscamos a alguien que tenga paciencia. Buscar, one of our verbs that's commonly used with the subjunctive because we're searching. Buscar is to search. Necesitar is to need. We're not sure of the end result with those verbs. ¿Hay restaurantes aquí que sirvan comida japonesa? Are there any restaurants here that serve Japanese food? This is using the verb haber in the form of a question. Right? When we're not sure, we're asking about information for which we're not sure. So, subjunctive being used there. Tengo una amiga que saca fotografías muy bonitas. I have a friend who takes really beautiful pictures. I have this friend. I know I know una is an indefinite article. You're like, oh, I thought that was a clue for subjunctive. Well, it's similar to that very first example that we looked at, right? That we have a verb that's not usually used in the subjunctive, where we're using it and we're certain about the existence of that antecedent. I have a friend. I know this friend. This friend exists. No need for the subjunctive indicative here. Saca. Hay una carnicería que está cerca de aquí. Different from number 3, in that number 3 is a question, and number 5 is a mere statement of fact in the indicative. 6. No vemos ningún apartamento que nos interese. We don't see any apartment that interests us. Ningún, the use of ningún, inherently going to be in the subjunctive because that thing, or that person rather, doesn't exist. Number 7, conozco a un estudiante que come hamburguesas todos los días. I know a student who eats hamburgers every day. Wow. So, the fact that you know that person, you're certain about that person, and therefore present indicative. Finally, number 8, similar to number 3, hay alguien que diga la verdad. Is there anybody who tells the truth? That is a wonderful question to ponder in the year of our Lord 2025. All right, let's go through the beginning of activities 1 and 2. This is on page 68. I don't think, honestly, we're going to get to 69. We'll make that our warm-up for next class based on how the lecture is going. But I'm going to go ahead and get you going, pause, and then see and give you the correct answer so you can check. So, activity 1, very similar to that practice activity that we just went over, but you have to create, right? Utilizing the verb provided, create your conjugation, either in the indicative or the subjunctive, based upon what's provided in the main clause. Buscamos un hotel que tenga piscina. We're looking for a hotel that has a pool. Buscar, to look for. Verb that uses the subjunctive. Moreover, we have un, indefinite article. Tenga, because our subject is third person singular, un hotel. ¿Sabe usted dónde queda? Excuse me, quede. Queda? The book actually says queda, but I would imagine that, let me actually double check. Yeah, queda. I think you can make an argument for subjunctive here because it's a question and you're not sure if the person knows the answer. So I'd actually push back based on the notes. But that might be, I don't know, uncertainty, right? Because it's the form of a question. So correct answer according to the book, queda. In my opinion, correct answer according to the notes that we've been reviewing, quede. Number 3, ¿hay algún buzón por aquí donde yo pueda, P-U-E-D-A, pueda echar una carta? Question. It's very similar to number 2. Not sure about the response, therefore subjunctive. I'll pause and then give you the correct answers to the rest of part 1. Ana quiere ir a la carnicería que está. Even though this is an expression of want, we know where it's located and therefore está. Yep, está, present indicative. Encontramos un restaurante que sirve comida típica venezolana. We found a restaurant that serves typical Venezuelan food. Present indicative. Doing great. ¿Conoces a alguien que sepa? Subjunctive, not sure if that person exists, especially in the form of a question. Necesitas al empleado que entiende. Excuse me. Necesitas al empleado que entiende. Entiende. We know this employee because of the use of el. A and el together make al. So we know that this employee exists. Finally, number 8. No hay nada en este mundo que sea gratis. Negation. Therefore subjunctive. All right, part 2. Just to give you the correct answers here, forming these all together in the indicative or the subjunctive. Yo conozco un panadería que vende pan cubano. ¿Hay alguien que sepa la dirección de un buen carnicería? Yo quiero comprarle a mi hermana unos zapatos que le gusten. Ella no encuentra nada que le guste en esa zapatería. Tienen dependientes algo que sea más barato. ¿Conoces tú algún banco que ofrezca cuentas corrientes gratis? Nosotros no conocemos a nadie que haga tantas diligencias como nosotras. Nosotros necesitamos una línea de metro que nos lleve a casa.